interesting right now. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lois. We're happy to have you. All right, I will pass it to Serena.
Howdy, it's Serena. I use she or they pronouns. Good to see everybody. I'm sitting in the shade of a bush that I know Maya and Ryan once tended, so connected with them through the hibiscus. You can see it.
Oh, yeah, I remember planting that.
I'm doing a project with this hibiscus. You planted it? Okay, we'll talk. We have to talk. I'm just going to be listening, and then I'm going to be painting some trim later because I'm doing some makeover. And I have to send my address to Jen to get a kit. And let's see. Lexa, do we have time for another?
Yes, I was just about to bounce in. We're going to do maybe 2 more minutes of intros, and then for any folks who don't get the chance to introduce themselves, we can do that at the end. And we just want to start the readings, but let's do a couple more minutes.
Oh, this is Lexa. I'm in Pennsylvania, the Lehigh Valley. I'm a bump out from the Norris family, and they're in Lincoln Heights. Hope you heard that. Who didn't go?
How about Courtney? Chloe Courtney.
Hi, my name's Chloe, she, her pronouns. I'm in New York, and this is my first time attending the event. So I don't have embroidery materials, but I do have a little weaving that I might work on, if that's kosher. So thanks for having me. And I will, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying that's totally fine. Absolutely, anything you want to craft.
Maya, do you want to bounce it to someone else, or?
Feel free to bounce.
Let's see, Alex, have they introduced themselves?
Hi, if that's me, Alex. I'm from the Metabolic Studio, and I'm here in Mar Vista, and nice to see you all.
All right, I will bounce it over to Dee Rainer.
Hi, Rainer in Baldwin Hills. Happy to be here. I'm not sure who's gone yet. If you could raise your hand if you have not. Aaron.
You're muted.
Aaron, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Hello, my name is Aaron, calling from Metabolic Studio in Los Angeles, California, going by He Series, and today I will be working on organizing the studio and driving home. So, thank you. I'm on a phone, so it's hard to see anyone else that hasn't gone. I'm only seeing one.
Bump it for you, Aaron.
Thank you.
All right, let's do Asuka.
Hi, my name is Aska. It's pronounced Aska.
Sorry.
Nice to be here. I'm glad that these are coming. I have my embroidery. I'll do as much as I can. I do have to go, but I can't wait to hear the readings.
Awesome, thank you so much, and thanks for the correction. I am going to do our introduction, and then we will get started on the reading. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the Abolitionist Reading and Native Plant Embroidery.
Can I introduce myself?
Oh yes, please.
Hi, I'm Shakura. I live in Burbank. I don't embroider, but I have a whole lot of stenography homework to do that I will do while I'm listening. So thank you for this.
Of course, thank you. And again, any crafts that anyone want to work on or any work you want to do is totally fine to do. Doesn't have to be embroidery. So just a little brief intro about, context about what we're doing here. The Metabolic Studio is located in downtown Los Angeles and is the practice of the artist Lauren Bond. Since 2016, Lauren has been conducting a community evening and potluck on Thursday nights, which began right after the last presidential election when it became necessary for us to come together and create a space to voice what was going on in our communities and how we were all being impacted by the current administration. So the Thursday evenings always started with a potluck and included message making in our printmaking workshop. And the practice of coming together once a week has also included many handcrafts with community members working with clay, weaving, and embroidering. Since the pandemic hit, we've had obviously to stop gathering in person and have moved on to the Zoom platform. Many of you here have already received embroidery kits in the mail, and for those of you who are interested in receiving a kit, please put your name in the chat or feel free to email Jen Curtis from the Metabolic team. She'll put her email in the chat and we will mail a kit to you. And in the kit, you'll find a line drawing on fabric of a botanical plant, which is part of the food and medicine that the Metabolic Studio is currently growing on 2 studio sites along the LA River. We are also growing food and medicine up in Playa Hunadu, so-called Owens Valley, where LA steals its water, and in Vermont as an effort to give away free food to folks in need right now. So we drew images of the plants we're growing, transferred the drawings onto fabric, which we sent out to y'all, along with an embroidery hoop, needles, and thread. And in the kit, you'll also receive a return envelope with postage. So you can send that back to us when you're done, and we'll stitch it into a community quilt that will be eventually exhibited and accessible online. So please feel free to reach out to Jen if you're interested. A week after we hosted our initial embroidery circle, the world changed. The witnessing of the murder of George Floyd, broadcasted across the globe in the midst of a global pandemic. Metabolic collectively decided to turn our focus on educating ourselves and our community about systemic racism, and specifically about prison and police abolition, a topic that has decades of literature for us to dive into. Questions like, how can we do better? How can we become better active accomplices in the movement for Black lives? One way is to hold space for readings and discussions that can help provide the fertile soil for a vibrant future where we can all thrive. So tonight we're going to be reading Who Are the Real Looters by Leilani Dowell, written in 2005, and U.S. Capitalism Puts Oppressed Nations and the Poor Behind Bars by Monica Moorhead, written in 2000. There are some content warnings in the Moorhead essay. I will warn you before we read these passages, and you can feel free to turn down your volume. I will also give this symbol when the passages have ended so that you can turn your volume back up. And Ryan just took a phone call, but he will be back soon. He's going to be reading with me tonight. And oh, here he is.
Hi.
We also would like to invite community members who'd like to read the first essay, Who Are the Real Looters by Leilani Dowell. The second one we're going to read because we've highlighted the content warnings and we want to be cautious about that. But I am going to, where did I put that link? I'm going to put the link in the chat of there's a free PDF copy of this reading. Could you read the question while I look for the link?
Yep. So before we get started with the reading, we're going to give you a question to think about, kind of to ponder, and then we'll discuss it later on after we're done with the reading. And that question is, how does our society define and approach crime? Who is incorporated in the narrative of crime and who is left out? I'm going to put that question in.
Oh, wait, sorry, before you copy it, I'm going to paste the reading into the chat. Okay.
We're going to put the question in the chat as well to ruminate on.
So are there any folks who feel specifically like they're wanting to read the Leilani Dowell piece out loud with us? It's just a couple pages. Yes, Joan, I saw your message if you are wanting to. And if anyone else is, feel free to just unmute yourself and.
Should I then just, should I start?
Yeah, that would be great if you wouldn't mind.
Okay. Who Are the Real Looters by Leilani Dowell from Workers' World, September 5th, 2005. Many government officials and much of the corporate media have focused their discussion and coverage of Hurricane Katrina on the so-called looting of storm-ravaged cities. On August 31st, two photos published on the Yahoo News website caught the attention of web bloggers. In both, people are wading through chest-deep waters with food in their hands. One caption describes the young black man shown as, quote, looting a grocery store, unquote, while the other describes two white people as, quote, finding bread and soda from a local grocery store, unquote. While Yahoo News was quick to offer a disclaimer that the photos were taken by two different photographers who wrote the captions, the effect remained the same: the criminalization of black youth. Racism has always been a tool of the capitalist ruling class, wielded to keep the working class divided and to justify war, occupation, and poverty. Now the state is using the racist view of black people as, quote, looters, unquote, to justify an outrageous lack of response on the part of the federal government to the needs of the most oppressed in the Delta region, before and after the hurricane, as well as to force yet another occupation of troops onto a community of color. The big business government in Washington has looted the Delta region for decades. It looted public services for poor people while giving huge tax breaks for big oil operations in the region. To pay for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it looted money from levee repair and other infrastructure upgrades that could have prevented much of today's death and destruction. And then it looted the people a third time by completely ignoring their cries for help after the storm hit, failing to provide for excavation, food, housing, or clothing for the survivors until 4 days later, when many had already died and a health emergency had been called. The right to survive. It is criminal that the media would even suggest that people whose only way to get food, water, and clothing is from locked stores are, quote, looters. The US government, in fact, should have immediately announced that the people had the right to take whatever they needed from the stores to survive. In trying not to sound too harsh on those left with no resources, the media sometimes tries to differentiate between, quote, good, unquote, looters, the ones who are only taking food, and the, quote, bad, unquote, ones, those who take other goods from stores. This happens to include clothing on most accounts, which is badly needed by people who've been wading and swimming through filthy water for almost a week. But even if people take things other than food and clothing, is that the real crime here? Given the long history of economic repression in the area, the history dating back to slavery, they're entitled to a lot more than that in reparations for generations of suffering. Yet the capitalist politicians with the media as their faithful allies use tales of, quote, looting, unquote, and lawlessness, unquote, to blame the victims of this disaster for the failure of the government to carry out its mandated responsibility to help the people of the region. It is the same reason given by Michael Brown, the much-needed director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, who said that the death toll from the hurricane is, quote, going to be attributable to a lot of people who did not heed the advance warnings, unquote. This kind of blaming the victims is nothing new in the United States. After the terrible Johnstown, Pennsylvania flooding of 1889, the headline in the New York Herald blazed, quote, drunken Hungarians dancing, singing, cursing, and fighting amid the ruins, unquote. The Hungarians were the most recent immigrants of that time. After big storms in Galveston, Texas in 1900 and the flooding of the Mississippi River in 1927 that inundated New Orleans, the scapegoats were Black people, many of whom were rounded up and transported to work camps. parentheses, the storm after the storm, New York Times, September 1st, 2005, close parentheses. Today in New Orleans, police and military operations against looters have replaced rescue efforts in some areas. The Associated Press reported on September 1st that, quote, the number of officers called off the search and rescue mission in order to go after the looters amounts to virtually the entire police force in New Orleans, close quotes. The AP article then describes city officials using equipment taken from an office depot and says that, quote, during a state of emergency, authorities have broad powers to take private supplies and buildings for their use, close quote. Why isn't this entitlement given to the people, especially when the government fails to respond to a crisis? It was a Toronto Star of Canada, not a US newspaper, that put the issue of, quote, looters, unquote, into perspective. It reported on September 3rd about what had happened before the arrival of food and water from the federal government, 4 long days after the hurricane struck. Quote, thousands of refugees lined the street outside the New Orleans Convention Center yesterday, weak, begging for help and accusing their government of leaving them here to die. Instead of the federal government stepping in, they said they had been saved by looters who smashed windows of abandoned stores and distributed food and water to those left with nothing. The imperialists realize that immense anger is brewing in the region. It is the same type of righteous anger, maybe even more intense, that led to uprisings like the 1965 Watts Rebellion and the 1992 Rodney King-related rebellion in Los Angeles. In those instances, the code words, quote, looting and riot, close quote, were used to downplay and even ignore the justified rage in poverty-stricken Black communities occupied by brutal, racist cops. Then, as now, the images of, quote, looters, unquote, were overwhelmingly of Black youth. The National Guard is sent in with tanks and guns drawn, then and now, to protect private property over human lives, but also to ensure that self-organization of the masses does not occur. Anger over the racist policies of US imperialism is not contained to the Delta region. Across the country and the world, it has only intensified with each news account of the devastation. It is coupled with anger about the continued US occupation of Iraq, which was brewing long before Katrina struck. End of article.
Thank you so much, Joan. Beautifully read.
Thank you, Joan.
We are next going to read U.S. Capitalism Puts Oppressed Nations and the Poor Behind Bars by Monica Moorhead, written in 2000. And I said this in the introduction, but I'm just going to reiterate that there are content warnings in this piece, and we will give those content warnings before we read anything. But just for folks who do need to turn their volume down, I'm going to do this symbol to let y'all know that it's safe to turn the volume back up. Yeah.
All right. U.S. capitalism puts oppressed nations and the poor behind bars by Monica Moorhead from the pamphlet Mumia Speaks from August 2000. On November 14th, 1998, a conference on, quote, wrongful convictions and the death penalty, end quote, was held in Illinois. The conference was a stunning affirmation that the so-called justice system in the United States is completely awry. 28 women and men of all nationalities testified. They all had been on death row in different parts of the country. They came together to tell their horror stories. Each had been wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death. Only through the pressures of the volunteers, family members, and independent research outside the justice system were they able to win their freedom. Most of their cases had been fought before President Clinton signed the 1996 Effective Death Penalty Act, This new law makes overturning death sentences even harder. Under it, most of those at the conference might have already been executed. This is going to be a trigger warning, content warning real quick for a kind of brutality against an immigrant. On February 4th, 1999, 4 plainclothed cops in the borough of the Bronx in New York attacked a young African immigrant in the vestibule of his home. They fired 41 shots. 19 hit Amadou Diallo of Guinea, killing him instantly. Diallo was unarmed, completely innocent of a crime, and had only a wallet in his pants. The cops said they thought his wallet was a gun. On February 25th, 2000, all 4 cops were acquitted of any crime. In February 2000, the prison population in the United States, which was under 300,000 in the early 1970s, reached 2 million inmates. This makes the U.S. the greatest prison house on the planet. And I just want to interject here and say that today the U.S. holds 300,000 more, making it 2.3 million people in prison. The U.S. establishment has expanded the repressive state apparatus over the past few decades in the 3 main areas: capital punishment, police aggressiveness, and by establishing what has been called the, quote, prison industrial complex, end quote. This growing repression has aroused resistance. Thousands of people defied police to take the streets in New York to protest the Diallo verdict. Hundreds more in Washington and San Francisco took to civil disobedience arrests to demand a new trial for death row inmate and political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal. Meanwhile, a movement was gaining momentum around the country to declare a moratorium on executions. Racism and fascism. The expansion of police powers can't be separated from the ruling class ideology of racism. Right-wing politicians made, quote, law and order, end quote, a major electoral issue, with being, quote, tough on crime, end quote, meaning virtually the same as being hard on the black community. While the pressure has been from the right-wing racists, both Republican and Democratic administrations have approved this increased repression. These officials took funds from education and other social benefits and transferred it to the police and the prisons. Both far-right and centrist capitalist politicians, and even those considered political liberals, have encouraged this development. The U.S. ruling class of billionaires and bankers has given full backing to the increase in prison, and has become the accepted plan for controlling the masses of the people at a time when the gap between rich and poor grows ever wider in this country and in the world. It is in place in anticipation of wider revolt when the current capitalist expansion gives way to a collapse. The U.S. rulers grew rich by exploiting enslaved labor and pillaging native land. Racism was the ideology used in an attempt to justify these thefts. It is thus no surprise that the communities of color, African American, Latino, Native, and Asian, bear the brunt of the vicious police attacks and the weight of the prison walls. Repression in the U.S. seems to have little in common with that of classical fascism. There is not devastating economic crisis. There are no extra-legal Nazi stormtroopers, and even the Ku Klux Klan, the U.S. equivalent of the Nazi gangs, seems to play a minor role today. Instead, police and courts carry out the repression under the cover of the bourgeois legality. But in communities of color, the police operate like a fascist gang. They're the occupying army of an internal colony, and the prisons are concentration camps for the poor and oppressed. Bourgeois democracy is but a form of capitalist rule. After all is said and done, capitalist democracy serves the rich and the super rich. The explosion of the prison industrial complex exposes the utter bankruptcy of bourgeois democracy and the deepening repression that it heaps upon the poor, especially people of color. The facts speak for themselves. At the end of February 2000, two black Texas death row inmates, how do you say this?
Panchai Kamal Wilkerson and Howard Guidry.
Thank you. Took a guard hostage for 13 hours. They were justified in their action. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain by carrying out this heroic act. Kamal was an articulate 28-year-old who was a Secretary of Defense of Panthers United for Revolutionary Education, an organization of Texas death row prisoners who studied Marxism and revolution. What were the main demands of these two men? First, to have an independent investigation into inhumane living conditions on death row. The other was for Texas Governor George W. Bush to issue a moratorium on executions in Texas. Despite mobilizations across the country and in Texas itself, and while courageously fighting tooth and nail to the last minute, Panchai Kamal Wilkerson was executed on March 14, 2000. The death penalty. There are 3,600 people awaiting execution in the United States. The state of Texas is second only to California with over 460 people on death row, but is executing more people at a faster rate, sometimes 3 or 4 a week. Bush has presided over 123 executions in 6 years, earning him the nickname, quote, Governor Death, end quote. In 1972, following 5 years without executions, the Supreme Court ruled capital punishment unconstitutional. This victory followed the upsurge of the civil rights movement. But in 1977, the High Court reinstated the death penalty, despite arguments that it was not only, quote, cruel and unusual punishment, end quote, but was also racially biased. At first, the rate of executions was slow. The first inmate executed even said publicly that he wanted to die. But then the executions gathered momentum until in the late 1990s, about 100 a year were being officially murdered. In June 1998, the Death Row Penalty Information Center published a study on the racist character of the death penalty. A white person charged with murder is more likely to get life in prison than the death penalty. The DPIC states, quote, race is more likely to affect death sentencing than smoking affects the likelihood of dying from heart disease, end quote. The report revealed that in Philadelphia, for example, the odds of receiving a death sentence were nearly 4 times higher if the defendant is black. In courtrooms around the country, contemptible racial slurs abound and go unchallenged. Many racist remarks are made in front of juries by judges and lawyers, including by the defendant's lawyers. One DPIC illustration, quote, when a prosecutor refers to a Hispanic defendant as a racial slur, as quote, a racial slur, I'm not going to say what it actually says, as happened in Colorado death penalty case, it sets a tone of acceptance of racial prejudice for the entire trial. Acts like the following are common. A prosecutor in Alabama said that he barred several potential jurors because they were affiliated with predominantly black university. A reviewing court considered this, quote, race neutral, end quote. In Philadelphia, Assistant District Attorney John McMahon used a training video for new prosecutors instructing them on how to exclude black jurors. In 16 of McMahon's cases, black jurors were struck from the jury 4 times as often as others. McMahon has prosecuted 36 murder cases. Some of those defendants are on death row today. The race of the murder victim is a determinant of the death penalty. Black people and Latinos are more likely to go to death row if accused of killing whites. In Kentucky, for example, 100% of inmates in 1996 were on death row for allegedly killing white victims. None was there for the murder of a black victim. According to the DPIC, in the entire history of the United States, only 38 whites have been executed for murdering black people. Some groups are for abolition of capital punishment because of the barbarity of the practice. Some give priority to combating its racist bias. For communists, it is also a class issue in a capitalist country like the United States. The capitalists uphold the death penalty because they will use anything at their disposal to intimidate the working class. Their aim is to maintain rule, and the death penalty serves their aim by deepening and broadening repression. As long as the death penalty is a tool of the capitalist class against the workers, the working class movement must oppose it. After years of struggle by the families, friends, and supporters of death row prisoners to abolish the inhuman and racist systems of executions, huge cracks have appeared in what was a ruling class united front for the death penalty. A moratorium on executions issued by Illinois Governor George Ryan on January 31st, 2000, has given renewed hope to the national campaign to end the death penalty. The governor was forced to take the action after a 13th death row prisoner was exonerated. 12 people have been executed in the state since 1990. Ryan, who earlier championed the death penalty, now says he can no longer defend the system. Following his decision, activist groups have moved other legislators to consider declaring a moratorium in their states. This is a positive development revolutionaries and Marxists welcome. Right now, the struggle to win a moratorium on executions appear to be taking place within the electoral arena. The struggle to win a moratorium to temporarily put a halt to the death machine should become a grassroots issue. But even if this struggle has to begin from the top, it does provide activists with an opening for struggle. One reason for this debate is the growing concern among capitalist politicians and think tanks over the U.S. image. This country has the most people in prison and an alarming rate of poor people, especially people of color, being executed. Maya's going to take over.
Police brutality, killer cops. Police brutality is an institution that is as widespread and deeply rooted in capitalist society as exploitation itself. Indeed, exploitation cannot be maintained without police, and wherever there are police, there is racism and brutality. When cases such as those of Amadou Diallo, Abner Louima, or Rodney King break into the headlines because police have been caught in the act red-handed, the capitalist establishment feigns outrage and shock, but this is strictly for the benefit of the public. Year after year, the bosses dish out hefty salaries, large budgets, and high honors to police chiefs and commanders across the country. These chiefs and commanders, in turn, administer and cover up for the armies of cops in every municipality and township, large and small, that brutalize the oppressed peoples and the working class on a daily basis. A recent Human Rights Watch report, quote, "Shielded from Justice, Police Brutality and Accountability in the United States," focused on police brutality in a sample of 14 cities. This relatively modest study compiled enough information on police brutality to lead to massive criminal prosecution of cops at all levels. That is, it would have if the establishment had the least interest in abolishing police brutality instead of covering it up. For example, the US government, always on the lookout for so-called, quote, human rights violations by governments that Washington is trying to undermine or overthrow, could have started the search in any city in the USA. A look at a few of the biggest cities involved gives the picture. This next section is a section on torture in Chicago, and there are a lot of content warnings, so I will give all of them. Just gonna let you know. In Chicago, 65 incidents of police torture were documented between the years of 1972 and 1991. the next sentence is a description of those. So I encourage anyone who doesn't want to hear it to turn their sound down. They include the use of electric shock applied to suspects' genitals and other parts of their bodies, burning a suspect on a hot radiator, and psychological torture techniques by and under the supervision of a commander, John Bunge. No one was ever prosecuted. Some of the cops who took part in the torture were retired with full benefits. Another was recommended for valor by the mayor and promoted to captain from lieutenant. In 1996, there were 3,000 complaints against the Chicago police, most by Black and Latino residents, for brutality, racist treatment, and abuse of authority. In only 6 cases did the authorities even consider dismissing the cops, and then no one was dismissed. In Los Angeles, according to HRW, the videotaped beating, this is a quote, the videotaped beating of Rodney King exemplified so much that was, and in some cases still is, wrong with the LAPD. Many of the components of the King incident are common to less publicized abuse cases. There was the obvious race factor. The beating followed a vehicle pursuit, and once stopped, the defendant was not considered compliant enough, a common scenario in police beatings. When the man who videotaped the beating and King's brother attempted to report the incident, they were turned away or ignored. Inaccurate reports were filed by the police. 3 out of the 4 officers eventually indicted had been named in prior complaints. In fact, it is likely that if this incident had not been videotaped and broadcast widely, any complaint about the beating would not have been sustained, since the sustained rate for complaints was about 2%, end quote. According to the HRW report, Black people and Latinos are still routinely, quote, proned out. That is, made to lie face down with their arms and legs spread, just for walking the streets or driving in their vehicles. The vicious canine dogs trained to bite are still used to terrorize people. Many of the killer cops identified by the Christopher Commission after the Los Angeles Rebellion are not only still on the force, but 2 have shot and killed people since. Chief Parks ignored the commission's mild recommendation. In New York City in 1992, Mayor David Dinkins appointed the Mullen Commission to investigate corruption in the NYPD after cops in the 30th, 9th, 46th, 75th, and 73rd precincts were caught selling drugs and beating people to keep them from talking. Quote, what emerged, wrote the HRW report, was a picture of how everyday brutality corrupted relations among police officers and city residents. The Mullen Commission heard from officers. This next section is another content warning about police brutality. The Mullen Commission heard from the officers who admitted pouring ammonia on the face of a detainee, from another who threw garbage and boiling water on someone hiding in a dumbwaiter shaft. Another doctored an escape rope used by drug dealers so they would plunge to the ground, and the same group also raided a brothel while in uniform and terrorized and raped the women there. Mullen found brutality sometimes serves as a rite of passage to other forms of corruption and misconduct. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, like Chief Parks in LA, disregarded the mild measures of oversight recommended by the Mullen Commission. These recommendations are never mandatory, legally binding, but are also but are basically window dressing. This next sentence is another content warning about police brutality. Since then in New York, Abner Louima has been tortured, Amadou Diallo was shot down in a hail of 41 bullets, and Anthony Baez was choked to death. These are just the most notorious of the cops' crimes. Philadelphia's police, reported HRW, are grappling with the latest of the corruption scandals that have earned them one of the worst reputations of big city police departments in the United States. There is an undisturbed culture of impunity that surfaces and is renewed with each successive scandal. As each new generation of police officers is taught through example that their leadership accepts corruption, got distracted. As their leadership accepts corruption and excessive force. Quote, as a result, police officers have unlawfully injured and killed citizens. The city has paid enormous sums in settlements and awards, and many minority communities are distrustful of police officers who too often act like criminals. The shortcomings of the department are reinforced by a police union that tirelessly defends officers accused of human rights violations, end quote. This is the police force that made the case against Mumia Abu-Jamal and made sure no one would testify in his behalf at trial. The HRW report has similar reports about, quote, liberal San Francisco and smaller cities like New Orleans, Minneapolis, Providence, Rhode Island, Portland, Oregon, and others. It leaves out some of the even more notorious police departments in the South and Southwest, such as Houston, Phoenix, Dallas, or Birmingham. It leaves out Louisville, Kentucky, where the police in March 2000 attempted a fascist-like revolt against a mayor who fired the police chief. But the picture painted is sufficiently clear to issue an indictment against the entire police establishment, the politicians who appoint them and cover up for them, and the ruling class that promotes the system of police terror against the population. It is absolutely naive to regard this virtually universal existence of police brutality as something, quote, out of control, something that has escaped the supervision of the authorities, a result of poor administration. The art of administration has been brought to its highest pinnacle of development by US capitalism. Wall Street and the Fortune 500 can administer global empires that stagger the imagination. They can summon armies of efficiency experts at a moment's notice when it comes to downsizing the workforce or merging giant monopolies. If the ruling class were so inclined, they could wipe out police brutality. These bosses and bankers, the millionaires and billionaires, control the arteries of political and economic life, the big business parties, and the state and local governments throughout the country. But the very idea that they would put a stop to the intimidation and terror practiced against the workers and the oppressed is like expecting them to voluntarily cut off their right hand. The cops are there to make sure that during this great Wall Street boom, there is no rebellion by the masses of people. The workers' wages are getting relatively lower, their working hours are getting longer, and they are forced to give up social services like healthcare, welfare, childcare, education, and housing to serve the balanced budget of the bondholders, the military-industrial complex, and the Pentagon. The cops are there to feed the prison-industrial complex with Black and Latino youths who can't get jobs on the outside, but are forced to work at slave wages on the inside. It is impossible to regard the phenomenon of police brutality as anything other than a systematic policy of the ruling class to intimidate by force and violence the millions of oppressed people both in and out of the workforce. As such, it must be opposed by an equally systematic organization of the masses into a powerful force that can defend itself against the terror. Commissions, review boards, government investigations of every kind always leave the same parasitic and brutal structure intact after all the publicity is over. The communities, the unions, the movement are still left to face the cops. The working class and community organizations must ultimately organize to defend themselves against these cowardly, hired thugs of capitalism. The prison industrial complex. The United States has only 5% of the world's population, but has 25% of the world's incarcerated. That amounts to 2 million people, now 2.3 million people. This number includes 130,000 in federal prisons, about 1.2 million in state prisons, and almost 700,000 in city and county jails, where people are held for short terms or are awaiting trial. An unknown number of people are under house arrest, confined by means of electronic monitoring devices. In Texas alone, George W. Bush became governor in 1994. The prison population increased from 41,000, in Texas alone, since George W. Bush became governor in 1994, the prison population increased from 41,000 to 150,000. That's 150% in 6 years. These convictions came about mainly for drug possession. The irony is that it's an open secret that Bush himself is a former drug user. 60% of those in federal prisons are drug offenders with no history of committing violent acts, while 60% to 80% of all prisoners have a substance addiction. Only 1 out of 10 inmates receive any kind of drug treatment in prison. In addition, 70% of the prisoners in the US are functionally illiterate. In a July 1999 report, the Justice Department estimated that some 16% of prisoners are mentally ill. This makes over 300,000 inmates of the country's federal and state prisons and local jails who either had a history of mental disease or had stayed overnight in mental hospitals at some point in their lives. An additional 800,000 mentally ill people are on probation in the community. So the so-called criminal justice system has major responsibility in providing or in criminally neglecting to provide mental health care for close to 1 million people. The Justice Policy Institute report entitled, quote, "The Punishing Decade, Prison and Jail Estimates of the Millennium," includes the latest numbers and trends in incarceration from the US Justice Department. The JPI report illustrates how the US prison population grew at a faster rate during the 90s than during any other previous decade. By the end of the year 2000, there will be 2.07 million people behind bars. Looking now at subgroups, a federal study done by the General Accounting Office reports that there were twice as many women incarcerated during the 90s as the decade before. This indicates an even faster growth than for the male prison population. Most of these women are serving time for what are called nonviolent drug crimes. These women prisoners suffer a higher rate of HIV infection and mental illness than imprisoned men. 84% of female federal inmates and 60% of female state inmates are mothers. Because of systematic racism, Black women are 8 times more likely to be incarcerated than white women. Latinas have a higher rate of incarceration as well, compared to the overall population. And more women prisoners are courageously coming forward to report that they are victims of sexual abuse and rape at the hands of male guards.
Prisons for profit. Prisons have little to do with, quote, crime prevention, end quote, and everything to do with repression and exploitation. The prison industrial complex is an integral component of the globalization phenomenon of raking in super profits for Wall Street investors during this post-Soviet imperialist expansion era. This current boom becomes about mainly the privatization of prisons and the youth. Primarily African American and Latino are the main targets. For instance, since 1991, while the rate of violent acts has decreased by 20%, the number of people in prison has increased by 50%. According to the U.S. Department of Justice 1997 statistics, quote, violent juvenile crime, end quote, has declined by 9.3%, but the population of youthful juveniles in privately operated facilities has increased by more than 10%. Even as prisons are privatized, the U.S. government is spending more money on jails than ever before. In 1996, Washington spent more money on prison construction than on university construction, almost $1 billion. This was the same year that President Bill Clinton signed away welfare. A study called, quote, The Color of Justice, end quote, substantiated that within the California juvenile system, youths of color are twice as likely as white youths to be tried under the same rules as adults, which subjects them to harsher sentences. California has one of the biggest prison systems in the world, with more people incarcerated than Belgium, France, Great Britain, Germany, and Japan combined. The number of prisoners has grown from 19,600 in 1977 to over 160,000 at the end of 1998. California is also notorious for its law that sentences those convicted 3 times for a felony, that is, for a higher level crime, to an automatic life sentence with no hope of parole. The quote, 3 strikes and out law. Study co-author Dan McAllister wrote, quote, discrimination against kids of color accumulates at every stage of the justice system and skyrockets when juveniles are tried as adults. California has a double standard. Throw kids of color behind bars, but rehabilitate white kids who commit comparable crimes, end quote. Los Angeles County produces 40% of the juvenile court cases that make it to the adult courts. The study showed that of the 24,000 young people arrested there in 1996, 56% were Latino, 25% were black, 12% white, and 6% Asian. Of the 561 cases that made it to adult court, 59% were Latino, 30%, I'm going to restart that sentence. Of the 561 cases that made it to adult court, 59% were Latino, 30% were black, 6% Asian, and 5% white. Compared to whites, black youths were 18.4 times more likely to be convicted. Latino youths were 7.3 more times more likely, and Asian youths were 4.5 times more likely to be jailed. The study pointed out that in Texas, black and Latino youths make up just 1/2 of the state's youth population, but they make up 80% of the imprisoned youths and 100% of juveniles housed in adult jails. The disproportion is even more astounding considering there are equivalent drug abuse problems in white communities and communities of color, and so much of jailing is drug-related. Just from these statistics alone, we can see the role that racist repression plays in the social composition of who is incarcerated. But that still remains a political and social symptom of this crisis. It also has an economic basis that drives it forward. The bottom line is this. Under capitalism, inventors and bankers will put their money into the sector of the economy, no matter how anti-human it may be, in order to maximize profits. This is not a matter of policy, but is based on the independent laws of capitalist development that drive big business to gravitate to wherever the rate of profit is the highest. The cost of prison construction has averaged annually for the past decade a staggering $7 billion a year. The U.S. government has spent more money on prisons than building universities. It costs $35 billion annually for incarceration. That figure is expected to rise to $41 billion by the end of 2000. If one counts all prison labor as working for the same firm, the prison industry is the second largest employer in the country, with 523,000 employees, second only to General Motors. Starbucks, Microsoft, Victoria's Secret, Best Western, and Boeing are examples of U.S. corporations that super exploit prison labor. World Research Groups, a New York-based investment firm, summed up the corporate takeover of the correctional facilities this way, quote, while arrests and convictions are steadily on the rise, profits are to be made. Profits from crime. Get in on the ground floor of this booming industry now, end quote. Prison slave labor. Profits arise not just from the prison construction or management, but also from prison labor. Between 1980 and 1994, the value of goods prisoners produced from $392 million to $1.1 billion. The Corrections Corporations of America, the country's largest private prison conglomerate, is a main factor. The CCA operates 46 penal institutions in 11 states, including 7 juvenile facilities. Its stock value climbed from $8 a share in 1992 to $30 a share in 1997. One investment firm called CCA Stock, quote, the theme stock of the 90s, end quote. Transnational corporations no longer have to shut down factories here and go abroad to set up sweatshop conditions, not with super cheap labor locked up right here in the next state. Quote, competitive prison labor, end quote, means a CCA prison in Tennessee can pay the prisoners a maximum, quote, wage, end quote, of 50 cents an hour. In Ohio, prisoners make car parts for Honda for $2 an hour, while the average wage for a unionized worker at Honda is $20 to $30 an hour. In Oregon, prisoners slave for $3 a day, no matter what the industry, and this slavery has been, quote, legalized, end quote. Trans-World Airlines can pay prisoners $5 an hour to book reservations by phone, 1/3 of what it pays to its non-inmate workers. The multi-billion-dollar prison industry has now expanded to manufacture clothes, car parts, computer components, shoes, and golf balls. It was especially gratifying to see the youth in Seattle during the World Trade Organization meeting trashing Starbucks. Starbucks prison workers can't even afford to buy their coffee. Wall Street is not alone in terms of making super profits off of prison labor. There is the Federal Prison Industries Incorporated, a unit of the Justice Department which, quote, employs, end quote, 21,000 inmates in federal prisons. This corporation pays inmates anything between 23 cents to $1.15 an hour. Last year, FPI reported $540 million in sales to its only customers, federal agencies. This captive labor force manufactures electronic components, furniture, and clothing. Union jobs threatened. A captive workforce can make super profits for local, state, and national governments, and slave labor can be pitted against their other workers with better paying jobs. There is growing concern, especially among labor unions, that FPI will become more and more privatized. In fact, the FPI Board of Directors has proposed that it expand its services and products to the private sector. Shouldn't the unions make it their business to organize prisoners and demand union wages and conditions so they can't be used as scab labor? There is a bill before Congress called the Prison Industries Reform Act. The act has the backing of corporations and many Republicans. If passed, this act will allow the federal prison industries to compete directly for private contracts while phasing out its 7-year relationship with the government. The bill's sponsors want to lure factories back from abroad to super exploit prison labor at home. The federal prison population is expected to increase by 50% by the year 2006, from its current 130,000 to 200,000. This expected increase is due to the severity of prison sentences for drug convictions, the eliminations of parole and the federal level, and the lack of drug rehabilitation. This means more cheap labor to super exploit. All the repressive arms of the state work hand, sorry, I'll restart that sentence. I had a bug flying on me. All the repressive arms of the state work hand in hand to rebuild up this imprisoned army of the unemployed, and the sky is the limit. The courts play their part by providing providing incompetent defense lawyers for poor suspects, railroading innocent people to jail, or handing out harsh terms for minor and non-violent drug offenses. Then there are those waiting to be jailed. In a December 1998 Atlantic Monthly article, it was reported that the backlog of arrest warrants stands at 2.6 million people because of overcrowding in the prisons. The prison expansion is spiraling out of control. A sector of the capitalist class has a big stake in continuing to enrich itself on the state-subsidized prison industry. Prison expansion has also had a big impact on impoverished rural areas, with devastating layoffs in other industries. Prison construction has created an economic boom in correction jobs and related industries. Reform the prisons. There are some immediate plans in the work to help reform prison conditions. For instance, Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton from Washington, D.C. has submitted 3 bills in response to the increase of women in federal prisons. One bill will require those states receiving federal funding for prison construction to submit a plan on how they propose to provide health and other services for women inmates. Another bill would require the Bureau of Prisons to utilize existing prison funding to establish 2 pilot community-based facilities in the Washington area for nonviolent, short-term, pregnant offenders. And a third bill would establish sentencing alternatives in the federal system, such as allowing first-time nonviolent offenders to serve their sentences at a community-based facility. A fight for prison reforms is progressive, especially if there is a struggle from below. But looking at the situation in its totality, these 3 bills, if Congress passes them, are like putting Band-Aids on cancer. These bills fail to reach the heart of what is wrong with the prisons. These prisons are concentration camps and modern-day slave plantations for the poor, the oppressed, and the youth, who have no real future under this system.
We have just 2 more pages, and then we'll have discussion. Political prisoners and the fight to free Mumia. There are more than 3...
Oh yeah, you're right. We're here.
There are more than 3,000 political prisoners in the U.S. These heroic women and men, the majority of them from nationally oppressed communities, either entered prisons as activists before the 1960s and 1970s or became political in jail, like the murdered Black Panther leader George Jackson. They all have at least 2 things in common. They stand against racist repression and other forms of injustice, and the capitalist state wants to silence them. Many political prisoners are well known, like American Indian movement leader Leonard Peltier, the Move 9, and the Puerto Rican independence fighters, remaining in prison. The most recognized prisoner on death row is Mumia Abu Jamal, the voice of the voiceless. Mumia is more than just another innocent man, like so many who languish in apartheid-like dungeons. In the eyes of the US government, he is, quote, guilty of being an uncompromising, unwavering revolutionary who has helped to expose police brutality, the death penalty, and other forms of racist atrocities since he became a member of the Black Panther Party as a teenager. Mumia's fight for a new trial has stimulated unity among progressives and revolutionaries of all nationalities and ages. The struggle to free Mumia and all political prisoners is tied to the overall struggle against a class system that persecutes the poor, workers, the oppressed, and all who resist the tiny clique of parasitic bosses and bankers. Marxists will continue to search for an opening to struggle. They will reach out to both the existing political movement and reach out further to new layers of the masses on these issues. The opening right now with the most potential is the struggle to free Mumia Abu Jamal. By demanding his right to a new trial, the movement can explain how Mumia got railroaded to death row in the first place. It can also generalize to explain the role of the capitalist courts. These courts railroad to prison not only revolutionaries like Mumia, but all poor people. We can not only show how Mumia was a victim of a police frame-up and brutality, but also link his situation to millions of others who have been brutalized daily by the cops and will never receive real justice. And Mumia would be the first to say that, yes, this is the right thing to do. This is just not about me, but about the whole rotten capitalist system that is quick to oppress and repress the majority of humanity to make a lousy buck. The most powerful factor that can win a new trial for Mumia, the one capable of making the government step back from his, quote, fast-track execution, is the organized force of millions of outraged people from every community. This is the urgent task of the progressive and revolutionary movement in the United States at this time. In the spring of the year 2000, Mumia's case is at a critical point. To bring the story of this serious injustice before a broader public, the movement has called a meeting from Madison Square Garden in New York on May 7th. This renowned meeting place, usually considered a showplace for the major spectacles of capitalist society, will for a day become the center of a struggle to free a heroic opponent of that same capitalist system. The state, and especially the police force, wants to execute Mumia as a vehicle to strengthen their repressive apparatus and to strike a blow against the movement. To save Mumia and free him, the movement has to help create a dynamic atmosphere that will make the ruling class worry about the threat to its stability if the state tries to murder Mumia. A victory in this case will be a strong first step forward fighting for all the oppressed against the repressive capitalist state. Free Mumia, Leonard Peltier, and all political prisons. Fight police brutality. Tear down the prison walls. I love this essay. So we're going to now have discussion, and before we do, I would love to read our community guidelines out loud. Where are they? I have too many things open on my computer. Oh gosh.
I think you had them on your computer already.
Okay, here. Sorry about that. Okay, so guidelines. We agree that any community member that is white or a non-Black person of color will not use the N-word. When referring to or when reading the N-word, the community member will say, quote, N-word. We agree not to blame ourselves or others for the misinformation we have learned, but to accept responsibility for not repeating misinformation after we have learned otherwise. We agree to listen respectfully to each other without interruptions. Only one person speaks at a time. However, this does not mean we should ignore problematic statements. We are dedicated to creating a space for calling people in when possible, instead of solely relying on calling people out. However, both approaches are valid and can be done with care and respect, with the goal of helping each other learn. We acknowledge that we may be at different stages of learning on the content and discussion topics. We agree that no one should be required or expected to speak for their whole race or gender. We can't, even if we wanted to. We will hold each other's best interests at heart. We hope everyone has come to the table to learn, grow, and share. We will trust that people are doing the best they can. Let's challenge and encourage each other to do better. Share responsibility for including all voices in the discussion. If you have a tendency to dominate discussions, try taking a step back. If you tend to stay quiet, try challenging yourself to share ideas so that others can learn from you. The facilitators are not experts. They are here to help facilitate the process. They and everyone in the group are here to learn. We also recognize that everyone has an opinion. Opinions, however, are not the same as informed knowledge backed up by research. Depending on the topic and the context, both are valid to share, but it's important to note the difference. To engage in deep learning, we will want to lean more toward informed knowledge and gain practice reflecting and speaking thoughtfully on difficult topics. It's okay not to know. Keep in mind that we are all still learning and are bound to make mistakes when approaching a complex task or approaching new ideas. Be open to changing your mind and make space for others to do so as well. The facilitators are not moderators. They are not trained to moderate personal grievances. If discussions stop being about the reading and instead breach into accusations and aggression, please respect the facilitator switching gears and refocusing on the text. And for some reason, I have an old version, but we wrote down a new one, which is that please respect the silence, in that if there is long pauses, that's okay. Sometimes people need long pauses to speak up. So silence can be beautiful sometimes. And I am going to reiterate the question that we had asked right before, which is, how does our society define and approach crime? Who is incorporated in the narrative of crime? Who is left out? So if anyone wants to specifically target that question, you're welcome to, but also the floor is open to answer what are parts of the readings that surprised you or stuck out to you.
Very basically, I'd say that our society defines and approaches crime by taking it from the point of view of someone who has been hurt. And that is defined by the laws, but I think that's where it starts. Somebody is wronged. And that definition is open to interpretation, but I'd say that's a beginning start to how I understand what it is.
I want to chime in too. I can't get over how important I feel that Ava DuVernay's 13th is. It's something I watched years ago and I more recently watched again. And I feel like this Who is Left Out is, in a way, and sorry if this may seem crass, and I feel like white people are left out. I don't mean to laugh at that, but when we consider how from slavery to Reconstruction to Jim Crow to mass incarceration, and really thinking about within 13th, for some reason my mind always goes back to these horrible images from Birth of a Nation, that terribly racist film and film history, but for some reason I'm attached to that Who is Left Out. And I feel like there's a lot of people outside of, liberal places like New York and Los Angeles and other urban areas that tend to be liberally minded. But I just feel there are so many white people in this country that are left out of this conversation. And I'm really happy that, Metabolic is doing this reading group, because I think white people really need to be faced with it. So I guess I'll stop there.
This is Lexa. I think Nick is saying something important. In my area, building prisons became a growth industry, and people applauded that their unemployment rate went down. I think a lot of this is done and people turn a blind eye to what's happening. Thank you.
I also can't help but be curious what maybe everyone thought about this exploitation of labor within, I could see in the chat, of course, this exploitation of labor of people within prisons. And it's insane that this goes on in our country, and this privatization of, you know, the prison industrial complex. But I don't want to, I have to admit, in the guidelines, I'm kind of a person that might talk too much, so I don't want to talk too much, but I'm a Gemini. I also, I have to bring up that, you know, all of us, I think, are really invested in not having Trump become our president. And who is our other option? That's Joe Biden. But I think Joe Biden has a really complicated history with legislation and mass incarceration under the Clinton presidency. And I think it's so crucial, and we've learned this from the last election, that we shouldn't focus just on presidential elections, but local and state and, you know, other elections. And I think it's so crucial to hold even people that we're voting for like accountable to what are your stances on incarceration, and what is your track record on incarceration. And yeah, again, I might talk too much, so I'm going to stop there.
I'd like to respond to the original question again, which was how we think our society defines crime. And this is, I'm sure, obvious to everyone from just listening to the reading, but I think it's important to say that it has a different definition depending on your race, and that if you are white and you commit a crime, it's seen as a mistake, systemically seen as a mistake or an error that can be rehabilitated. And if you are a person of color, it's treated completely differently, as if it's like endemic to who you are. And so I wanted to respond. It's obvious from the reading, but just thought it was important to say.
I have to say, I'm just pretty struck by the statistics in that piece. I would like to read it because I think I understand the information better when I'm reading it than when I hear it. But I feel like America is also reaching this point of having a real existential come to God moment with capitalism as it relates to social issues and racism. And I think I'm still like digesting just how expansive the exploitation is beyond, you know, the sort of privatization of prisons themselves, but looking at the labor, as you said, the labor that comes out of these prisons. Like, I just had no idea that it was on that level. I mean, it's incredible. Thank you for reading that. This has been just really profound to realize and devastating.
Earlier today, I heard an expression that I hadn't heard for a while, plantation capitalism, and that it is a form of slavery, what we do with the prisons. The new Jim Crow.
Just wanted to give one of the statistics that kind of popped out to me. And that's that in the 6 years that George W. Bush was governor, from 1994 to 2000, the prison population in Texas increased from 41,000 to 150,000. That's kind of mind-boggling to me.
6 years.
That was 6 years.
And what was the overall, what was the statistic about, there's 2.3 million Americans incarcerated? Was that something like that?
That's right now. When this book was published, it was 2 million people, and now it's 2.3, around 2.3. And then one more quick sentence on some pretty devastating statistics. This is in 2000. While 60% to 80% of all prisoners have substance addiction, only 1 out of 10 inmates receive any kind of drug treatment in prison. In addition, 70% of the prisoners in the US are functionally illiterate.
I'm curious. I have a question.
Hi, this is Evelyn. Can I say something?
Please, yeah. Anyone's at any point you're able to talk. Yes.
I was, thank you for reading. You put me into a thought process that I wasn't expecting, and I'm grateful. And so I was just looking things up while you were reading. My brain can just, anyways, I was paying attention, but I just read this article in the LA Times about that the Cal Endowment, I knew they had like a program of schools over prisons. So it's just incredible how much like it can impact preventing people from, getting there with education investment. And like California sort of had a good track record of trying to switch the curve, but it's just so disheartening now, like, because even here it said, like, when the economy is strong and we invest in education, it makes a difference. But what's going to happen now? It's like everything is, how do we look at this, like, going forward? We just have to keep pushing for education and, to support, like, early education, to make people able to read, anyways, thank you for letting me talk.
They say, originally they were saying prisons have 3 different types of purposes. One is deterrence. The threat of prison will keep people from doing things. Another idea of what prison is for is retribution, to punish people for doing things. And the third would be rehabilitation. But now there's a fourth, which is slave labor.
I have a comment. Hello?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. I have it's almost confusing to me as to how they can identify a person that is, the prisoners, that they are functionally illiterate, yet they provide no training, to function in society or to improve any type of skills. So why is it that they are functional illiterate? How does that play in the part of keeping them in prison or to incarcerate them? Or did they get there because they are functional illiterate when African Americans are kept out of the say advancement or out of the marketplace or having to improve their lifestyle? How do they become functional and literate, and why is that such a purpose in prison? It's the language and the laboring does not tie into it. It makes sense to me, all of it. It's crazy.
I had a similar feeling about that language. Is that from what we just read?
Yes. Would y'all like if we read that again?
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't know where it was.
All right, we're gonna find it. So maybe we'll mute ourselves, and then when we find it, we'll.
Okay. Yeah. Look.
Doesn't functional illiteracy have to do with your ability to navigate in society? So you can read at a 4th grade level, but that's not enough skill to really hold a job, pay your taxes, know what to do if you even get a traffic ticket. I think I read once that functional literacy, you need to be at least a 9th grade reading level. But even a reading level, there's like a society smarts. So I think sometimes people end up in prison because they don't know how to get out of it. They don't know they need a real lawyer. They don't have enough money for a real lawyer. And so the system just sort of gobbles up like fodder.
I found a quote. Oh, sorry, Lois. Did you want to talk? I can give the quote after.
Yeah, well, I sort of want to make 2 comments on that. So I can I can relate to what she just said to the extent that if you're you're in crime and you don't have the smarts how to get out of crime or how to go that deep into crime. But functional illiteracy based on that alone is not enough to me to have that identity laid on you, because a lot of people that does drugs, so I've been told, are good at math, they're good business people, they got these remarkable skills. But when they apply to African Americans, that's functional illiterate. If it's applied to a person like Howard Hughes, they're brilliant.
Mm.
So I'm listening for your comment.
Yeah, thank you for that. The quote is, sorry. Okay.
Here.
Okay. 60% of those in federal prisons are drug offenders with no history of committing violent acts. While 60% to 80% of all prisoners have a substance addiction, only 1 out of 10 inmates receive any kind of drug treatment in prison. In addition, 70% of the prisoners in the US are functionally illiterate.
I wanted to say, just a comment that country was built on functionally illiterate people, to tell you the truth. I mean, it's really who's doing the judging of what's functionally illiterate or not. If I may not know the classical Tchaikovsky or I may not know the rap stars, that may put me in some type of literization category. So I always like to question what's the guidelines for which people call people these names or deem them that such, because I think sometimes it's an exaggeration. Thank you.
I think the word functional is also interesting to think about, because if someone there is a function like what was talked about with incarcerated populations being used as cheap labor. There's a function to taking people off of like the playing board, so to speak, as far as employment and social power. And if you can, if you think of competition or whatever, if you can take a bunch of people off the map and out of the game, then there's more to carve up for the other people. And then if you can use the labor of the people that you've taken off the map for free or next to free, like there's a function to that. So designating certain populations and writing them off serves a function in this economy and in this society.
I don't want to talk into the wee hours of the night. I know that West Coast, East Coast, I'm on a little bit of a later time with Lexa and a couple of other people I know that are over here on the East Coast. But I mean, I know this is a slippery slope and we can really talk a lot about the whole complex, but I'm just, one thing that I've seen, there's a couple of Instagram accounts that I follow that I really love. One is Queer Appalachia. And anyway, they have this beautiful text that I've seen that says, capitalism is the virus. And it's interesting to me to think of all of these things. And I personally feel like this exploitation of labor, this exploitation of people for the gain of others, this general scheme of exploitation really can come down to this system of capitalism. And I'm, I don't know if I'm opening a can of vague worms, but I don't know. I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on capitalism as the virus.
Well, I'll speak next because we've got the same background, or the same painter in the background. I was actually picking up on something that went before, that the idea that the people that they put in prisons are literate or haven't had a chance to learn a degree of literacy, just as another example of funds need to be redistributed, that they've chosen to put the money into incarcerating people rather than educating people. I mean, there were all those statistics about how much money goes into the prison system versus how much goes into educating people. And yeah, I mean, when I mean, just to talk about the virus aspect, when the only measure is money of what is up or down, then there's no conscience in it. And I've been shocked several times. I mean, the first reading was about the prison labor that I was really ignorant about. I didn't know. I mean, I really thought, oh, that, you know, I'd heard they hammer out the license plates or something, but just all of these major organizations just brutally using them. And then it made sense what privatizing prisons was about too, that they just got, yeah, they've got slave labor, and it's, you know, it's shocking. And there must be, forgive me for coming to this without much information, but there must be people talking about, we can't do this, that this is a horrible system, and it's so latent with the prison labor. So just throwing that out into the mix too.
All right, thank you all. That was great. We want to move on to the next question, which is, Leilani Dowell describes a society that criminalizes people seeking food and water after a major crisis. How does this depiction of the term looters relate to the current crises we are facing today, and how can we shift this narrative?
I see this as an extension of this question of capitalism as it relates to inequity, and so many other things. But yeah, I mean, food and water are privatized and therefore part of this capitalist system in which we are all living in. And yeah, I think we're obviously reaching a very critical moment this very evening on the eve of, you know, these federal stipends being terminated for all intents and purposes. I just learned that states are not required to report the number of people whose water, power, utilities they terminate. It's hard to say how, you know, rent and evictions will be categorized or you know, organized statistically or reported, but it does seem like we are really as a country, I fear for our country, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I wish I had a more positive spin on it, but I think that I don't really see like our government offering any substantial solution or security in terms of those exact things. And if anything, I think what we're seeing on a state level is that like this will, I don't know, it'll be interesting is the wrong word, but we'll see how it plays out, right? Because it's going to play out soon. Do people have any resources to share, I guess, would be a follow-up question in terms of just the publicization of that, or just any resources for people to share.
So I want to say, I'm sorry, am I speaking over anyone? Okay, I hope I'm not speaking over anyone. A full disclaimer of I work at the Brooklyn Rail, and we do events also. And I'm thinking about exploited people in prison. And I'm thinking about a program that we did very recently about incarcerated women in Louisiana. And it became a project of these women that left prison and were paired with artists, and it became an exhibition that was exhibited in Louisiana and then moved on to New York. And my point in bringing it up is that I think from what I got from that is that you're kind of, there are moments where it's like, I care so much, but I don't know what to do. You feel like what is out there that people are doing. And for me, this was a really interesting event because there are these organizations in Louisiana, and I believe I would have to fact check myself, but I think Louisiana is one of the states that has the highest incarceration rates. I'm sorry if that was already said and I missed it, but there are organizations to help people and help formerly incarcerated people sort of get their life back, as most of them were stolen from them. However, I bring it up only because I think it's interesting. There are so many resources and things out there that we are hungry for, but we don't know how do we find them? Like, how do we get to them? And I can at least share this one example of an organization from my own recent experience. And I'll share the link in the chat, and I really encourage all of you to look at it because it's really, it's important to consider not just like me locally or like, you know, my community, but like our country and these areas that are terribly targeted and how people don't have much. So I'm gonna post that now.
Thank you. And I'm also going to put in the chat a list of resources and actions that I update every morning. So if there are direct actions that folks are wanting to take about decarceration, about police and prison abolition, and just general ways to get involved with events and a list of, you know, actionable steps, I'll put that Google Doc in the chat now and you can check it every morning. And I also just want to reiterate that I think it's really important that we make space for all members of this conversation. So for folks who have talked a lot, I'm going to ask that you stop talking and that we leave space for everyone in the conversation to have a moment. Thank you.
One quick and easy thing that I really appreciated Leilani Dowell saying, the terminology they used in the article we read was changing, instead of saying looters or rioters, using the word rebellion. Usually when you hear of the Watts riots or the riots that came after Rodney King or the riots in Minneapolis. If you think of these as the rebellion, the Watts rebellion, the Minneapolis rebellion, it shifts the narrative and doesn't criminalize the people. It actually shows that what they're doing is potentially courageous.
All right, we are going to move to the next question, which is Monica Moorhead describes, quote, police operating like fascist gangs. They are the occupying army of an internal colony, and the prisons are concentration camps for the poor and oppressed, end quote. What reflections come up for y'all based on this reading? I'm going to also put the next question on the table, so feel free to answer either of these. But the last question we have is, in what ways did the readings challenge the idea that the police and the criminal justice system uphold honesty and courage?
Can I say one thing? I keep thinking that goodness and courage is stronger than hate and anger, always. And it just made me think of that.
Thanks for that.
I guess one thing that I've been thinking about is just, which we've kind of touched on already, sorry, no camera tonight, is how powerful language is when we're speaking about these things, because, and how that can be used for propaganda, you know, when we use the word looters versus people who are trying to survive. And how often crime gets equated with morality. Like if you commit a crime, you're then called a criminal, and then that is like a very loaded term that we have. Like a criminal is someone who's bad. That's how we've traditionally labeled things. And then we're able to or what often happens is then these people get dehumanized, and I think that's really problematic when we start to think that just because someone breaks a law that there's somehow, because plenty of things get criminalized that I wouldn't, you know, agree with. And I mean, that's kind of what happened with like the war on drugs, is that you just, rather than looking at it as like a systemic issue or as like a mental health issue or something that requires other resources, it's immediately deemed a crime, and then we're able to like just write something off because we're like, crime equals bad, someone who doesn't commit a crime equals good. And I think, yeah, so language is something I'm just thinking about on this discussion. And I agree, to answer the, or it wasn't really a question, well, I'm agreeing with Monica Moorhead's statement about how the police operate as fascist gangs. I would agree with that. All right, thank you.
Some civil disobedience is criminal, but you have to do it to change the laws in the future.
I think it's right on, and also brings to mind the connection with the role of our military and international relationships, and just how defunding the police is about rethinking how we want to allot resources and take care of the society. For me, it has to be connected to thinking about the military and funding the military-industrial complex, and how that is part of a program of defunding all kinds of other areas of society.
Thank you all for sharing, and I think now we can slowly shift our discussion into embroidery. And if anyone feels like sharing what they've been working on during this time, please feel free. And if you didn't get the chance to introduce yourself at the beginning, please also feel free to do that. And if you have anything you want to say based off of the readings, please also do that. So thank you all.
Hi, Maya and Ryan. Thank you so much for having this. I'm going to leave right now. You guys rock, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It was great to see you.
You too.
I'll share. I'm mending a shirt. I tried to get out a stain and I made a big hole in it, and it doesn't belong to me. So I'm fixing it for somebody I care about.
I'm Jen, and I'm calling from Studio City, and I'm working on flowers that Cindy's daughter drew, and then Cindy and I silk screened during Thursday night engagements at the studio. So
Beautiful. Wow.
Good. Coming along.
Slowly but surely.
Yeah, I was gonna say our mushroom is also coming along slowly but surely, but we're doing this like stripy colored.
It's beautiful. I love it.
Yeah, it's full of expression.
I tried the knotting that Rachel taught us on the base. I don't know if you can really tell, but
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
there's some texture.
That dimension.
Yes.
It's been really exciting to see the embroideries slowly trickle back into the studio. They're all exceptionally beautiful and so creative, and there's so much energy you can feel.
I started my embroidery tonight for the first time, and it was pretty intuitive on how to put it on the loom. But like, I have to admit, I don't. Okay, so like if I want to change it and I want to cut the thread and like stop it, I guess if there are any like links or YouTube links or anything that anyone has to share that can help a self-taught embroiderer, I would really appreciate it, because I stopped embroidering halfway through because I was like, I have a vision and I want to do it this way, but I don't want to cut the thread and I don't know. So I'm excited to do something like embroidery that I never thought I would have wanted to do. But if anyone has any resources to share, I would really appreciate it.
Mine looks really good from the front.
Let's see, Alex.
Oh no, you're frozen. Oh wait, now you're back.
Oh, wow.
Little flowers.
Hold it up again.
But the back is crazy. Okay, I have to get it right. See there.
Wow.
So pretty.
Wow.
But I've been working. I've been painting on ceramic plates. Let's see if you can see what's going on. There we are, somewhere in there, there. Somewhere.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Just having fun.
Joni asked what the plan for the pieces we're working on in the chat. What the plan is it's going to become a big community quilt. So these will be stitched together and eventually exhibited. And yeah, I don't know if other folks from the team have more to share.
I didn't know that it was going to become a quilt, but that's exciting.
Okay, I promise I will stop talking. I talk so much.
No. I was just saying that during the discussion to make
Not at all. No, I'm sorry. I'm a Gemini sun.
Say sorry.
So I get it.
Keep going.
You're fine.
It's really interesting to consider quilts, because for doing something like this in a quarantine pandemic moment, it's really interesting for me. And some of the things that I worked on, I interviewed this amazing underground person, Penny Arcade of New York. But the pandemic has inevitably kind of, and of course I have to say this, like before George Floyd and before us thinking about in a really, really urgent way about social justice, which unfortunately we didn't do before that. But there was a lot of comparisons between the pandemic of COVID and the AIDS crisis. And the AIDS crisis, of course, is still happening, but the AIDS crisis of like the 80s and 90s, and people of my generation in New York asking people that lived through that generation, like, what was that like? I can't even imagine. And people from that generation being like, well, you get a little bit of an idea, maybe, with COVID. Oh God, why did I bring this up? Because
of the AIDS quilt.
Exactly. Thank you, Roxanne. No, it's so interesting that you're building this into a quilt. No, really, thank you, Roxanne. That exactly is what I wanted to say. It's interesting to build this into a quilt, because I mean the AIDS quilt is just really iconic and important moment of like a consciousness thing. And anyway, I don't know. I just felt to remark on that. So it's interesting that we're building a quilt here. So pandemic.
Well, that's certainly a vote for a quilt.
So going back to embroidery, Jen, I got it in the mail today.
Oh, wow.
I mean, literally, the mail lady just brought it to my door.
Wow.
So next week I'll have a new embroidery to do.
That's exciting.
I know. I really was hoping it would, but she comes late, so I knew that I probably wouldn't have it for today. Except I really don't know what kind of plant it is, so I don't know. Can you tell from seeing it?
I believe it's a poppy.
A poppy.
Let me see it again.
Yeah, that's the poppy.
A poppy. Huh. All right. It's on a very, very nice napkin with embroidered edges. It's really pretty. Thanks for sending it.
Oh, you're welcome.
I wanted to say something. I don't know if I'm audible. Am I?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yes. I wanted to say something. First of all, thank you so much, Maya and Ryan, for today's reading. I didn't get a chance to read it this time, and it was really good to hear that. I listened while I was driving back from Payahunadu to Obama's eulogy for John Lewis, which was incredibly educational. I didn't know so much about his life. I didn't know how many times he was arrested, and how willing he was to be arrested, and how part of his practice in a way that was. But I also wanted to connect a couple of dots with the choice in embroidery. Obama, in his eulogy for John Lewis, used the term Satyagara, which comes from Gandhi's political position, and it's an amalgam of two words, Satya, truth, and Gara, power. So Satyagara was the essence of Gandhi's political posture, and Obama brought it up to talk about John Lewis's ideology in reference to that. I'm bringing it up because early on in Metabolic Studios' response to Shelter in Place, we had a conversation on the Brooklyn Rails format with Dr. Vandana Shiva, who talked about how the seed is the most generative act of resistance we can take, because of the seed's ability to sustain us and nourish us and to reconnect us to the life web. So the idea of doing embroidery that represents native plants in the location that we are in is a way to connect to the theory that truth and power has the potency to lead us out of this mess. Even if we don't necessarily know the answer, we know that we can trust the process of deep, local, rooted, grounded connection to the life web. So I just wanted to offer that up about the connection between what we're embroidering and the political moment we're living in.
Yeah,
One
nice.
more thing to say is that I'm thinking less about these being sewn into a blanket than I am of them being sewn into a field. So that's in reference also to abstract art and the whole idea of a field works, which is like unity in a plane. I think there's something about sharing this time and space where the composition of putting everything that we've done through this reading series together as a field work is the operating idea of what I'm suggesting that we move toward, rather than a kind of blanket, which could also be, but it's more for me connected to a field and draws the connection to the native plants also. Thank you for letting me share.
I need to go to sleep. It's 10:47 and I'm like, I can barely keep my eyes open, but thank you all so much. And if you want to stay on, feel free. We'll see you again next week. And I appreciate all of you, and I learned a lot tonight. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Ryan.
Bye.
Bye, guys. Thanks a lot.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Metabolic, for doing this.
See you next time, Nick. And if you have any questions, just reach out. It's easy. Just don't be afraid to just start diving in. You can always tear out a mistake if you don't like it.
I have a really clear idea of how I want my plants to work.
There's no rules, Nick. There's no rules.
No, I just don't. I don't know.
Just have fun with it.
Well, Jen, I really appreciated your response to my message. So if you all want to join me on Thursday for the Angela David reading series, you can type it on
I understood. It's all good.
Anyway, lots of love to all of you. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for supporting it. Great to see you all. Yeah.
Bye, Nick. Thanks.
You too. We'll see you all next week.
I'll be here. Actually, I have a question. Wait, so is there an end date to this series, or?
Yeah, I think there is, but I think it might transform. I don't know.
I hope so. Okay. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Good night, Nick.
Good
Good
night.
night. Good night, everybody.
Hi, Rennie. Bye. Yeah.
See you next time. Oh, I think you're muted.
Okay, do you do the embroidery? You send the embroideries out?
Yes. So did you email me tonight?
So look in the chat.
Okay, let me just double check. Yeah, you know what? I got you. I got you on the list.
Thank you.
Sure. So we'll drop them in the mail probably mid next week. Hopefully you'll get it before the next one. And if you have any questions with the drawing or anything like that, feel free to reach out and keep going.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Good night, you too. Hello. Who is it? I feel